For the first 20 or so years of my life, I wanted to be the kind of person who read a lot of books, but I wasn't the kind of person who read a lot of books. And don't get me wrong, I did read some books. Most of those were ones that were assigned to me in class, and sometimes I feel like I was the only person who was actually reading all the books that were assigned to us. But even though I enjoyed what I was reading, I didn't read as an extracurricular activity. I never felt like I read enough. And how much exactly was enough? Well, it's kind of nebulous, isn't it? I mean, is this a book a week? A book a day? Is it reading situationally to unwind at the end of the day or to start the day on a positive note? I would say that I didn't have time to read, but then I'd still make time to watch anime. Now, I actually think that there is some value in that. When people nowadays tell me that they should read, I'll tell them that there is no should in reading. Like whatever people do in their spare time, and especially whatever they do to unwind, there's value in that by virtue of it being the thing that they want to do with their finite minutes on earth, you know? And plus, if you actually do want to read more, then saying that you should read is a terrible way to set yourself up, because it puts you in the mindset of it being an obligation rather than being something you enjoy. And this is coming from a very personal place for me, because for the longest time, one of the things that kept me from being a reader was wanting to be a reader, rather than connecting authentically with the books that would bring me the most joy. In this video, I'm going to talk about the ways that I taught myself to love reading. And if you're looking to read more or pick up reading as a hobby, there might be some ideas in this video that work for you. Part 1, The Hunger Games. When I was 21, I read The Hunger Games for the first time. I'd had the books on my shelf for years, but the push that I needed was my girlfriend at the time telling me that it was one of her favorite book series. I read it and loved it and dumped her and finished the series. For a while after that, I looked for another book or book series that was as engaging and easy to read as The Hunger Games, because I wanted more, but not if it wasn't the right book. I tried reading more books in my final semester of college, but funnily enough, it was actually an incredible class that I took right there at the end that sealed the deal for me. Part 2. Genre fiction. This class that I took was about horror literature, and we spent a lot of time focusing on how horror literature works on us psychologically. You know, how do we think about crime, spies, heroes, and monsters? That class, and especially the essay by Freud, The Uncanny, was fundamental in shifting how I think about fiction, both literary fiction and genre fiction. I think these days most people have an understanding of the uncanny valley. The idea is that you can graph affinity for an object in relation to how much it resembles us. If an object, like a mechanical robot, doesn't look much like a human at all, then we won't have much affinity for it. But comparatively, we might have a little bit more affinity for a humanoid robot. As things start to resemble us more and more, like a cartoon character, we'll have more affinity for us, but it's not a linear climb. There's actually a point where things look so close to us that we actually find it creepy and unsettling, in the same way that we find disease and death unsettling. It's close to us, but it's not quite right. This is the uncanny valley, and we leave the uncanny valley when the rendering is fully human and we feel affinity for it again. This model can be very useful in determining why things creep us out, but it isn't very specific in terms of which parts of the human body creep us out the most, which ones are most subject to the uncanny. Freud argues that eyes and hands are particularly precious to us, so any mutilation to them are particularly horrifying. To build his case, Freud uses a bunch of examples which I guess were popular when he was writing, but didn't really resonate for me. For me, the scariest eye story is Coraline, where the villain threatens to sew buttons into her eyes. And then just last week I was enjoying the show You, right up to the point where he gets one of his fingers cut off. I shut that down and haven't been back since. That is to say that because of this class, I gained an appreciation for genre fiction and for what we can learn about ourselves by reading genre fiction. The biggest difference between college life and postgraduate life was time. I had time on my hands and a rudimentary appreciation for literature, and I spent a year and a half working in bookshops, so I had access to every book that came through. It was go time, and I read every story that I found even remotely interesting. Novels, nonfiction, short stories, authors I'd never heard of, genres I wasn't the biggest fan of, old classics, old favorites, and this is before I was on antidepressants, so sometimes I felt so dark and so terrible, and the only thing that could bring me out of that funk was reading a book that made me feel less alone. And sometimes I felt the absolute euphoria of connecting with somebody else over a book that we both read. This period meant so much to me, and I thought that I'd be able to keep it up while I was in grad school. But I couldn't. I spent another year not reading much except for what was assigned to me in class. But my first year was a lot busier than my second, and that second year I worked in the library where I was again surrounded by all of the books. Part 4, monitoring my reading journey. In the summer after I graduated, I decided to keep track of all the books I read. Instagram tells me that it's been 170 weeks since I made that post, and I've read 198 books since then at the time of writing this. This works out to 1 book every 6 days, averaged over 3 years. But that on average is doing a lot of legwork because my reading has not been consistent. The first year I read 37 books from the time I started keeping track to the end of the calendar year, which is about 1 book every 4.5 days. The following year, I read just 31 books, which averages to about 1 book every 12 days. And I think what it was is that early COVID really got me down. It was hard to enjoy anything. And as long as I'm lethargic and not really enjoying anything, it's a lot less effort to watch TV than it is to read books. When I take a closer look at when I read each book, the picture becomes even clearer. In the early part of the year, before the world shut down, I read 11 books, which is about 1 every 8 days. Then I read another 12 books during early quarantine, which I think of as ending in mid-July because that's when I left my job to go back to school. So during that period, that's about 1 book every 11 days. Then I stopped reading books for 3 months. But I came back strong with Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality because if anything is going to get me out of a not reading slump, it's gonna be that. And then in the last quarter of the year, I read 9 books, averaging 1 every 10 days. Some were for school, some were for work, some were for fun, but the point is that I got back into reading and I kept reading. In 2021, I read 63 books, or 1 every 6 days, and so far this year, I've read 67 books, or 1 every 4.5 days, right where I was at the beginning. So what does all of this show us? Well, it shows that reading takes time, yes, but also energy and attention. In the early pandemic, I had all the time in the world, but no attention at all. I was tired and lethargic and bored, and I couldn't keep myself entertained, let alone occupied. I stopped writing letters because I had nothing to say, and I stopped reading books because I couldn't concentrate. Funnily enough though, I could still create. That was the year my videos started really taking form, and I also churned out like 3 quilts. The other thing I can tell by looking at my lists is what kinds of books that I read. Before I started keeping track, I was convinced that my list would be full of smart people books, theory, psychology, philosophy, etc. And I do love that stuff and I read a fair bit of it, but it by no means dominates my reading list. Most of what I read in any given year is fantasy. So much so that I don't just log fantasy as fantasy, I log fantasy as fantasy and YA fantasy, and those are still my top 2 genres that I read. Fully 1/3 of the books that I read this year were fantasy fiction, and this is in line with my running total. For comparison, only 1/6 of the books that I read tend to be smart people books. Which, to be fair, if you go by the sheer numbers, is still a lot more than your average person is going to read. That's 1 every 5 weeks or so. And the other half of the books that I read are miscellaneous literature, genre fiction, crime, etc. But how could I have been so wrong in my estimate? Well, I think the big difference is that I spend a lot more time thinking about my smart people books as compared to the fiction that I read. When I read a really powerful nonfiction book, it's gonna stick with me for days afterwards. You know, I look up articles to see what other people have written on the same topic, and I incorporate the ideas in my own way of viewing the world in a way that I don't often do when it comes to fiction. That's valuable information, and it's made me a better reader, both in terms of volume and sustainability. And in conclusion, that's the thing about approaching a reading journey like this. It's easy to say, I should read more, or in my case, I should read more books that aren't just fantasy fiction. But one's reading habits have to come from an authentic sense of enjoyment, or they won't be sustainable. These days, I don't push myself to read, because I don't have to. If I see a book that I think I'm going to enjoy, or if a friend recommends me a book, I'll try it out, and chances are, I'm gonna have fun reading it. When I'm curious about a subject, I look up books on that topic and I read until my curiosity is satisfied. And when I find an author that I adore, I read every book they ever penned. And that is how and why I read as much as I do today. If you enjoy this video, go ahead and like. If you enjoy the content I make, don't forget to subscribe for more. And why don't you let me know in the comments down below how your reading journey is going. Where are you? Where have you been? And where would you like to go in the future? Hi guys! It's been a few weeks since writing and filming, and I am excited to announce that I have 3 follow-up videos. The first 2 videos are my top 10 recommendations for books and my top 10 recommendations for authors. I was careful to make sure there was no overlap, so make sure to watch both. They'll be coming out around New Year's, but go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss them. The third video will be my case for audiobooks. I didn't think this was still a contentious topic in the year of our Lord 2022, but based on the results of the survey I collected, I might be dishing out some hot takes. That one I haven't filmed yet, but it should be ready sometime in January or February. So stay tuned and stay subscribed because there is lots more to come.